Welcome everyone again to our webinar today on gender and freedom of religion or belief, or FoRB, in Asia. My name is Emily and I'm a Connexus Programs Officer at Search Common Ground, and really appreciate you joining us today. So this webinar is part of the Asia Religious and Ethnic Freedom, or Asia REF project, which is funded by USAID. This project supports efforts by local partners to expand FoRB in Asia and strengthens the capacity of those partners to lead efforts within those countries. I will drop a link in the chat for those who would like to learn more about the project. But in the meantime, with that background, I'm delighted to welcome our speakers today, Vija Herefoss and Ruhi. Vija works as a senior advisor on women in faith at Stephanus Alliance International, and Ruhi is the assistant director of research initiatives Bangladesh. Vija will provide an overview of the intersection between gender and FoRB, and Ruhi will follow with examples from the Bangladesh context. After the presentations, there will be time for discussion with the audience, so please leave your questions and comments in the Q&A box as we go, and we'll look forward to addressing your questions and hearing about your experience. So with that, I'll hand it over to Vija to get us started right as I share my screen so you can present.
Hello, everyone. It's my privilege to be part of this webinar, and the task that I have been given is to give you a short introduction to the normative framework of the intersection between freedom of religion and belief, or FoRB, and women's rights. I will address three issues very, very shortly. First, why is it important to actually look at this intersection? Second, how are these two rights actually interconnected? And third, we will have a very quick look at also how does the gender FoRB violations actually look like. So to start with, I have included this very, very basic information that we always use in the beginning, because it's always good to know that everybody is on the same page. So this basically just the two quotes of the basic text we use when we start thinking about the two intersecting rights. One is from Article 18, ICCPR and UDHR, that describes what FoRB is. And I suppose most of you would be familiar with this text. So the important part here is to remember that FoRB is about having, changing, and manifesting one's offense or religion. And the second quote is from CEDA, which describes what do we mean when we talk about the discrimination against women. And the most important aspects of this text is, of course, that the discrimination includes any kind of distinction, restrictions, or exclusion that is made on the basis of one's gender that leads to or has a purpose to nullify or impair the recognition, the enjoyment, and exercise of basic human rights and freedoms. So this is the starting point. These are the two sort of things that we need to keep in our mind when we think about the intersectionality. So why is it important to look at this intersection? Until recently, there has been quite little attention actually paid to this particular intersection, and there is a number of reasons for that. And most of these reasons actually are linked to misunderstandings around FoRB and around women's rights or gender equality that we find in both among FoRB activists, but also among the women's rights activists. And these misconceptions and misunderstandings have actually really been a stumbling block for bringing these two rights together. So let's just have a quick look at what are these issues that stand in the way for this intersection. First of all, very often there is a widespread misconception, especially among those who are not experts in FoRB, that FoRB is a right that protects religions, or rather than the individual freedom. So very often the argument is, yes, but FoRB is used to protect religions, very often conservative or patriarchal interpretations of given religions. And because FoRB is protecting these, women's rights definitely have nothing to do with FoRB. And as you know, of course, this is a massive misconception, because FoRB, as any other human right, protects the individual freedoms of the rights, not particular religions. Second, we also see that FoRB is occasionally used to justify harmful practices that is based on religious traditions, for example, such as FGM. And here again, the women rights activists would say, look, this is what happens. People who want to implement or use these harmful practices refer to FoRB as the reason why they should be allowed to do this without any critique. And of course, again, this is a massive misunderstanding because no human right can ever be used to violate another human right, which is the case is women's rights in this particular context. But this is again something that we meet quite often, this misunderstanding that FoRB is allowing to justify those kind of practices. And also there is the understanding very often implicitly, but sometimes also explicitly named that religion is necessarily bad for women, meaning that it is only patriarchal, only suppressive, and women's rights activists, especially the secular ones, would say that basically women has two choices. They could be free or they could be religious. You cannot have both of these things together. So the women of faith are actually put in a situation where they have to choose. And of course, what we see in this context, that kind of choice is actually an incredibly unfair thing to impose on women, because one should be able to enjoy one's own freedom of religion and belief and also exercise one's own freedom as a woman. And also sometimes what is interesting that we hear that the only reason to talk about freedom of religion or belief is to talk about freedom from religion. The only way forward for women is freedom from religion. Ironically enough, actually, freedom of religion and belief also protects that. Because although the title of the right is freedom of religion or belief, it also includes the freedom of conscience and also freedom not to believe anything at all. So in one sense, of course, freedom of religion and belief is also part of that kind of discussion. We also see, when we look at more the FoRB activists, we see that there is still a lot of gender blindness, presuming that FoRB violations affect men and women in the same way. So when you look at statistics on FoRB violations, you will very rarely find ones that is gender segregated. It is simply presumed that no matter what kind of gender you have, you experience the same kind of restrictions and the same kind of consequences from these restrictions. One of the many reasons why this is the case is, of course, that when one reaches out, for example, to religious communities in order to gather data about FoRB violations, usually the ones that are reached out to are leaders of these communities. And as you know, the leaders are very often men. And what happens in those situations, that their experience becomes a default experience, that the women's voices and women's experiences do not come forward. And because they are missing from the narrative, it is simply presumed that their experiences would be the same as men's experiences. So all these things are the sort of misunderstandings that stand in a way of talking about intersection or bringing those two rights together. But as I have just explained, these are misunderstandings, and it is important to address them so that we can actually talk about these two rights together. So how are they interconnected then, all the women's rights? I think that the most basic fact is that, of course, both women's rights activists and FoRB activists, they are fighting for the same group. They want to empower women. And that is an important point. There are not two separate groups. It is the same group. It is women. The second point, which is very, very important to remember to all of us who work with human rights, is that all human rights are indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. And this cannot be stressed enough, because sometimes we see that when it comes to FoRB and other human rights, there is a sort of attitude that it's like a buffet. You can just pick and choose the ones you like, and you can just abandon the ones that you do not prefer or do not like or find difficult. So FoRB is sometimes talked about as this sort of an optional right that you maybe talk about if you have the time or the energy or the interest. But this is this point that all human rights are indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated is center at the heart of the issue of interconnectedness between FoRB and women's rights. Because we know that if one right is breached, it automatically breaches other rights, because they are so tightly connected. So the conclusion is very simple. There can never be complete freedom of religion and belief without gender equality. And there can never be complete gender equality without freedom of religion or belief. One should be able to have both of these rights at the same time. And we also see that it is important to look at the interconnectedness between the two rights, because there are a lot of other things that come into this intersection. It's such rights as access to education, access to justice, healthcare. So all of these other aspects also play into, because sometimes there is a tendency to look separately at religion as a main issue or the main obstacle. But that is very helpful. It is much more helpful to understand how these different rights, access to education, access to justice, access to healthcare, FoRB, how do they interact and interplay with each other? How do they strengthen each other or weaken each other? So it is important, again, to look at a wider intersection of different kind of rights. It is also important to remember that both FoRB and women's rights are interested in raising or lifting up women's voices and agency. And this is a very important point to remember, because first and foremost, women are not a homogeneous group. We like to talk about women as if all women were the same, or all women have the same interests or the same backgrounds. But we see that there's a massive difference if a woman comes from a majority or minority religion, from urban or rural context, with having a lot of education or none, being employed or not being employed, belonging to the ethnic minority or majority. Their experiences and their response and consequences for violations will differ very much, which also means that we will see different kind of responses and different kind of reactions, how these women who are being affected by these restrictions would respond to them. And again, there is no one solution that is true for everybody. There will be some women who will take very pragmatic ways of dealing with it. Others will try to fight on a more sort of principle level. Others will just sort of withdraw from it completely. Whatever the choice is, it needs to be understood and respected. And also the agency aspect is important to remember, that women can be both gatekeepers and supporters of patriarchal, conservative, harmful practices, and they can also be champions for freedom. They are not just victims, and they are not all interested in achieving the same thing. So it is the agency aspect becomes very, very central for both women's rights activists and for FoRB. And of course, I don't want to mislead you saying that these rights are being perfectly harmonious and there are never any conflict. Of course, conflicts occur, and it's unavoidable that there will be situations in which one will have to ask, but how can we actually bring these two together? And then it is important to remember the very central aspect of human rights, that it's not a zero-sum game. It's not a pie that you have to pick sort of, if you get a bigger slice of this, you will lose some other part of the other part of the pie. The point is that you should seek to maximize all rights. And there is no one very clear rule that will apply 100% successfully in each case. One has to look at case-to-case base, having these principles in mind, that this is a way of trying to maximize both rights is the way to go. And finally, let's have a very quick look at how the gendered violations actually look like. These are very general patterns, and I really hope that Ruhi will be able to fill in these more concrete examples and also maybe say something to what degree she sees these as relevant in her own context. But these are just some patterns that can help you to understand some of the reasons and some of the main forms of how FoRB violations are gendered. And the most important thing, though, if you remember one thing from this seminar today, remember that FoRB violations are always gendered. Always. You always have to ask yourself, how does it look for women and how does it look for men? Because most likely it is going to look differently. The first thing that we see very clearly at the FoRB violations against men and women are actually perpetrated by different actors. As FoRB activists, we usually tend to look at the state as the main stakeholder, and we look at the FoRB violations that are perpetrated by the state, means imprisonment, different kind of legal restrictions, and these are absolutely relevant issues. But when it comes to women's experiences of FoRB violations, very often they actually are perpetrated by other actors, and these actors are family, local community, sometimes even their own religious local community, their husbands, their parents. So this is a different type of actor who is involved in perpetrating the violations. So women can experience domestic arrests, they can experience physical or psychological violence at the hands of their family members. They can even experience forced abortion or forced divorce, or in some even more horrid cases, even rape by family members as the punishment for converting, for example. Also, we see that the differences between the FoRB violations are also related or focused on person's role and value in society or their gender roles. Because we see, for example, that for men in most societies, men have the role as breadwinners and as protectors. And those would be the aspects of their identity that would be targeted. For example, they would be excluded from job market, they might be arrested, they might be conscripted, they might be killed. For women, we see that women's sort of value and role in society is very often related to their reproductive ability. Being mothers, being wives, we see, for example, that abductions and forced conversions very often happen among younger women in reproductive age. So that is also a way how to attack their community. And of course, in many contexts, women are seen as honor bearers of the whole community, and that is very often linked up to sexual purity. So we see that when women are attacked, sexual violence very often is a major method of attacking women, which we do not see as often among men. And again, it targets this specific value that they are given by their own local society. So, as I mentioned, some of the most common FoRB violations for men involve imprisonment, physical violence, torture, death, and all of these things are things that are focused and very visible. Usually when we read about FoRB violations or when we see statistics, these would be the things that we would hear. Numbers about imprisonments, numbers about killings or tortures or conscriptions. So very, very visible, very, very clear. Most common violations for women include sexual violence, abduction, forced conversion, forced marriage, social control, discriminatory personal status laws, as well as discrimination within their own religious or belief communities. And as you have probably noticed, this list is considerably longer than the first one, because when we look at women's experiences, they are much more complex, and also due to these different type of actors who would be the ones perpetrating the violations, it's also much more hidden, much more less visible, much more less known. We don't really know very much about women who are being held in domestic arrest or who do not have the right to leave their house, or who is being forced to abandon their children or are being kicked out of the house. And also when it comes to the sexual violence, there's still a lot of shame and taboo related to it. So the numbers that are being reported, of course, do not actually represent the actual numbers and the actual challenges. So that also becomes, there is a massive amount of violations which go unreported due to these different factors. And women are often subjected to double discrimination, both because of their religious or belief identity and because of their gender. Because in almost all societies, women would face a certain type of discrimination that is based on their gender, which is then usually strengthened or made even worse by then belonging to a minority religious group, for example. And finally, I also want to say a little bit about why is in a way, or why women are targeted. And there are three main factors that affect it. First of all, it is low risk to target women, because what we see, there is a lot of impunity. As I mentioned before, women might not even report the violations. They might be afraid themselves. They might be sued by their family or local community in order to preserve their honor. They might not be even taken seriously by the police or the justice system, even if they do come and report it. So it's very sort of easy to attack women because impunity is quite likely to happen. it also blends in with a general culture. For example, if domestic violence is sort of a silently accepted issue in society, then using domestic violence as a tool to control women's religious practice or religious conversion would go unnoticed because it would blend in with the general cultural patterns. And finally, it is extremely effective to attack women because women, as I mentioned before, are very often seen as the representatives of their community, of the owner of their community. So if one wants to attack a family, a local religious community, or a local sort of a community of social or ethnic community, the most effective way of doing it is going after the women. Because what happens to women is going to affect their husbands, their children, their local community, their religious community. And this is unfortunately a knowledge that those who perpetrate violations against women are very well aware of. So targeting women in order to threaten, in order to intimidate, in order to punish a whole community is a pattern that we see very, very often when it comes to FoRB violations. I will stop here and I will give a chance to Ruhi to come in and put some of this or maybe other things from her own context to see how this more normative aspect also is reflected in a more pragmatic way.
Thank you, Vija. Vija, that was quite an explanatory way of putting things together. And I think where you have left, I'll start from there actually, because my discussion would be more focused on practical aspects of how we exercise FoRB in Bangladesh, keeping in mind the gender perspective as well, because as you have rightly mentioned that we cannot see it in segregated form like FoRB and women's rights separate. We cannot afford to see it actually in a separate way. But before starting that, let me thank everyone here for giving me the opportunity. It's a pleasure being here. And of course, I don't have much time, but I'll try to make it short so that, I can discuss the most important part here. So when we talk about this right to FoRB or we are talking about gender rights, I think the first thing to look at is what law says in Bangladesh. What are the legal provisions, the legal frameworks that actually promote gender rights or actually promote the right to freedom of religion and belief. So I have actually tried to bring forth some of the important provisions that we have in the constitution here in our country. If you look at the provisions, I'm not going to read each one of them very separately, but if you look at them, you would get the idea that all of them, on the face of it, they talk about the inclusivity, including and promoting the gender rights as well as the FoRB. Because I think these provisions have actually focused on intersectionality of women's rights and in a wholesome way. But we have certain reservations here. I would not dwell upon those at the moment. But the civil society here, they have their own reservations regarding these provisions because we believe that though these provisions are promoting inclusivity and but still we see exclusion here, and maybe we would need some other meeting for this to explain in a more detailed way. Other than constitutional law, we have a penal code as well that actually lists down a few example. It's not the example, these are basically the nature of offenses. Those are being taken as violations of FoRB, we would say. But if you look at the provisions, like section 95 or section 295, they all talk about what you can do in public life, what you can't do, and how you want to worship. Like, there cannot be prevention of anyone observing their religious faith and belief. So if there's a prohibition, there's a violations, then these laws are there. Penal code is actually there. They are penalizing the offense. And I was a bit quick going through the constitutional provisions and the penal code because I wanted to put more focus on this particular slide. Let's talk about what personal law has to say. Because so far we have seen the constitutional law is promoting inclusivity. The constitutional law is talking about empowerment of women and empowerment of the disadvantaged or marginalized groups. And equally, the penal law is there to criminalize or to penalize violations of FoRB. But what does personal law say? Personal law talks about all sorts of discriminatory things that actually what Vija had just said, I mean, like, it all comes under this personal law stuff, I would rather say, because in Bangladesh, we have personal law for each community. Like for Muslims, there's one personal law. For Hindu, there's one personal law. For Buddhists, we have different personal laws. So, and these personal laws talks about more of private sphere, not public sphere. And that is where the conflict arises, because your constitution, your penal code talks about the public sphere, how women are addressed in public sphere, but personal law talks about the private sphere. And there is not much attempt being made to create a harmony between these two, because these two are going parallel with each other. And there is a demand for uniform civil code for a long time. But then in the absence of such civil code, I mean, like the personal laws are very much in place now. And that is where most of the violations are being taken place. So this aspect is one of the main area, I would rather say, that kind of, lead to violations of more and more FoRB rights in Bangladesh. I'll now talk about the existing structural mechanism that we have in Bangladesh. I've just spoken about the legal provisions that we have, the legal frameworks that we have, and how there is a conflict between the personal laws and the other laws that we have. But let me discuss a bit about how infringements are taking place, how violations are rather taking place. We have seen that Bangladesh has come up with some wonderful laws protecting women and, promoting gender rights. But unfortunately, most of these laws remain in books so far, because we don't see the effective implementations of these laws in Bangladesh. And like, if you talk about the child marriages, we talk about violations against women, and everything is on a higher scale. So, which means that actually there is no effective implementation of the law, in spite of the fact that there are some very good laws that we have here. And there is one report I would like to mention here that talks about like East Asia Forum report. That report has come up with a figure that from 2013 to 2021, there has been almost attacks on 3,600. Minorities have come under the attack based on their religious belief. This 3,600 people, the minority people, they were subjected to attack not based on any other thing except the fact that they had been professing some particular religious belief. So this says a lot about the situation of FoRB in Bangladesh. I mean, like if you look at the figure, and yes, truly speaking, this figure might be a bit higher as well, or it might be, there's no possibility of it going down, because we know that recently in Bangladesh, if you look at the cases from last 6 to 7 years, or even if you go back to 10 years back, you would see that there are a lot of cases where minorities have been subjected to harassment, subjected to torture in various ways. And when we say this, naturally, the women who were part of these minority groups have actually faced the discrimination in a double way. So this figure actually talks a lot. And now, if you ask me how do you, what is the reactions of the law enforcement agencies or even the state? So my answer would be, as I have already written, in most of the cases, there is a very different attitude from the state as well as the law enforcement agency. In most of the time, they do play a silent spectator role. And why they play a silent spectator role, there's a good explanation to that. Because in most of the cases, when minorities are being attacked for their religious belief, for their religious practices, those are being given kind of, political inclinations, the political rivalry, it all becomes a part of political agenda. So you never get to know who is the real perpetrator here. So it mostly goes like one of another attack based on some political hidden agenda or something like that. So that's why it kept on going like this. And there is one law that we have. In short, we call it DSA, but it's basically Digital Securities Act. It puts a lot of pressure on people who have dissent voices, who have their own opinion. Because the sort of laws are there which actually, even if you just go on expressing your opinion, even in social media, you might face the charges under this particular law for hurting the sentiments, for destroying the image of the country. So these provisions are there. And DSA is being by the civil society. DSA is being regarded as one of the law that is more regarded as a law violating the rights of FoRB, violating the rights of freedom of thoughts and concerns. Now, talking about why there is a declining in the state, like the state of right to FoRB. If you ask me in a very, I would very naively say all these things. So why I'd very naively say, because all these things are happening, but we kind of, for a long time, we wanted to believe that extremism doesn't exist in Bangladesh. It's kind of like the kind of belief that we have, whereas extremism has a lot to do with the declining state of right to freedom of religion and belief. When the rise of extremism and exploitation of women, if you see under the emergence of extremism in Bangladesh, this is the first point that I have included, because women has been used to promote extremism in a constructive way. I would say in a constructive way, though that's a positive word, but I would say in a constructive way, because of all the factors that Vija had just mentioned. All these factors are there. The patriarchal setup was there. The fact that woman doesn't go beyond a particular sphere. All these played a very important role in bringing women into this whole thing of promoting extremism in Bangladesh. And then maybe another reason that we can actually cite as a declining state of right to FoRB is probably the kind of political situations that we have here. I mean, I think it's a known fact that Bangladesh has been struggling with the political system for a long time now, because there are no consensus regarding the political parties, and there are this rivalry between the parties. These things have kind of contributed a lot in promoting maybe self-promotion. I would rather say self-promotion of extremism in Bangladesh. And one of the most important part that I'd like to mention here is for the rise in extremism, which actually kind of make contributing. It's a contributing factor for declining state of right to freedom of religion and belief, is basically the penetration of market, the increase of market economy, the increase of political economy, and the ongoing patriarchal setup of families. These are basically some of the contributing factors that have actually, that can be termed as one of the reasons, few reasons actually. And if you want to look back to since when Bangladesh has started, having this extremism thing, then we can say that it was back to 1998. This data has been collected from a particular report that has been published in Bangladesh recently. Number two factor that I would rather focus on, the shrinking space of civil society. There are considerable decline in the way civil society works in Bangladesh recently. I would not say it's very recent, but for the last couple of years, I mean, there are a number of restrictions being placed on civil societies, and there are the kind of environment under which civil society used to work. Now the environment has shrinked a lot. So these are some of the contributing factors. We can say that, that kind of contributed in the declining part of FoRB. And I've already talked about this increase of market and political economy as one of the contributing factors. Now, there might be some kind of thoughts that how the market economy can actually, give rise to extremism, or how market economy can actually, decline the state of right to FoRB. It's a very simple example. I can use very simple example here. Say we have this Ramadan month, for 1 month, where everyone keeps fasting. So you get to see these ads in the televisions, like they are promoting Ramadan, and they are promoting goods, they are promoting products which can be used by the Muslims in the month of Ramadan when they break their fast. So that is a clear message of, religious sentiments. You're promoting religious sentiments, but that kind of, it may come as a part of exclusion as well. You are excluding the others. And then you are giving, like, say, there are shops which are giving huge discounts on festivals for Muslims. There are discounts for festivals for Hindus. So this segregation, this inclusion of one and excluding the others can also be the contributing factor. And rise of intolerance. When I talk about rise of intolerance, as I've already said that there is an increase in extremism in Bangladesh. So naturally, there will be rise of intolerance as well. And how we are talking about rise of intolerance, which has led to the declining state of right to freedom of religion and belief. I have just given few examples here. Let me just discuss in brief that how these are the contributing factor. I think Taslima, I'm not sure how many of you are aware about Taslima Nasreen, but she's an author. She's an author from Bangladesh who is quite vocal about her opinion. And of course, her opinions didn't go well with few of the, the Islamic groups. So she's literally banned from Bangladesh. She has been ousted and now she's living in India. So she no longer lives in Bangladesh. She is the typical example of how rise of intolerance actually works and how it's contributing towards declining state. I'll give you another example of a case that even like if you do some Google search, you will find it there. Like, the people here, the Bengali, it's also a Bengali culture and it's also a Hindu culture that we wear tea. We call it bindi. In Hindi, we call it bindi that we put hair on the forehead, right? So now when, about this particular case, a woman was just walking through the road wearing this bindi and she was being subjected to harassment just because she was wearing this bindi. So this sort of things actually talks about a lot that, we cannot claim that Bangladesh is experiencing actually freedom of religion and belief because these all incidences are targeted based on religious belief, because a Muslim doesn't feel right that a woman should wear bindi because that is some part of Hindu culture. So similarly, the outfit, you would see that there's this girl who was being subjected to harassment because she was, according to the incidents, she was wearing some Western outfit. So she was being subjected to harassment at a public place. That was a rail station. Even this case you would find on the net as well. These are some of the examples of rise of intolerance. And then, of course, there is a continuous harassment of Ahmadiyya community in Bangladesh who are being termed as the non-Muslims instead of having the Muslim belief. So these kind of incidences, we would not say it's going down. We would rather say it's increasing day by day and intolerance is also rising day by day. Okay, now the question is who are radicalized? Because who are the people who are basically, promoting this extremism? Basically men and women both. It's not that we cannot, and we have not seen so far that other than men and women, people from other gender have been actually radicalized. So it's basically the men and the women both. And mostly out of this, the young people or the people who used to have not so affluent background, or maybe they have this family crisis history. But later on, after some incidences, we came to see that actually it's even the young ones from a good background, from a good financial background, they are also being radicalized to, promote this faith-based kind of messages that regarding Islam or extremism. Next. Involvement of women, I'm sorry, I think the woman word has been left out. Involvement of women in extremism and prevention. These are part of the data that I have taken from this particular publication that we had from Dhaka University, and that paper actually spoke about mostly how violent extremism is to be prevented in Bangladesh. So this data has been taken from there, and for the first time, we came to know that even women are being part of this extremist organization. That was in 2006 when one Taslima Begum, she was being arrested for being involved in violent extremism, for being involved with violent extremism group. Basically, if you look at the pattern of involvement of women for promoting extremism, then we would see that they are mostly the ones who are living in a private sphere. Like, they are preaching and teaching within a very small corner. They are not part of the public sphere. And in 2016, December, actually, we first came to understand that, okay, there is a presence of extremism in Bangladesh, because all of you must be aware about the Holy Artisan case that took place in 2016, and where the 5 young people actually killed so many foreigners as well as the local people. I think I'll wrap up very quickly now, because these are mostly part of the data, and I'm skipping the recommendation part because I don't think that would be necessary. If you look at the profile of the women who are being radicalized, or who are being promoted, or who are being part of this extremist group, the age, if you look at the age limit, it's between 20 to 29. And most of them are either students or homemakers. And if you look at the educational part, most of them are 10th or 12th pass. And their financial condition, 45% from that particular data says that they belong to the low income background. Professionally, most of them were homemakers and mostly radicalized by their husbands or family members. 92% of them actually had organizations affiliation. And regarding their marital status, 56% were actually married. So these data are being discussed here because just to give an idea that who are the women, those who are being radicalized, those who are being, being part of this extremist organization. I think I'll skip this part because we have already discussed this, the influences and everything. These are some of the measures that so far our government has taken, to deal with this growing concern about declining state of. The first one is, of course, there are a lot of awareness programs being undertaken, and there are protection mechanisms like one-stop crisis center has been established, legal aid has been provided, and there are some hotline numbers, toll-free hotline numbers have been actually made, so that mostly these are mostly for the women who are subjected to violence, and they can actually get the access quickly. Regarding prevention of violent extremism, nothing much has been done so far. But to counter the violent extremism, there are some actions taken, like hard measures were taken. There are a lot of arrests were made during those times, especially. And then there are a lot of electronics and print messages that have been circulated among the people to make them aware. The madrasa is basically the institution that imparts Islamic knowledge. So their syllabus has been revised. And there has been dialogue with the religious leaders. And then there are, I'm just going to explain the last one, Mahfils and Waz. It's basically a kind of meeting, informal meeting where you preach religion. And mostly it's being done by the people who are following Islam. So government started monitoring and restricting these kind of meetings, and that is quite commendable. I would wrap up by saying this, that is quite commendable, because we have recently seen a decline in the incidences of extremism part. So naturally, but of course, the minorities are being harassed like they used to. There is no decline in those things as well. But for violent extremism, we can say that Bangladesh has actually kind of handled it quite well, and it has managed to bring it down. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for your presentations. And I think it was really helpful to hear the background from Vija before we heard the more specific examples from Ruhi. So really appreciate your presentation. Anyone in the audience, if you have any questions or comments, whether you want to share about your experience from your context, or questions for Vija or Ruhi on what they spoke about, please feel free to share them. I will ask a question in the meantime. So my question for Vija and Ruhi, and I'll maybe start with Vija, is Are there specific activities that you've engaged in to promote positive change in the realm of gender, or like any initiatives or things, resources you would recommend to those who are trying to address violations in that realm? Yeah, any suggestions you have?
We have been working quite a lot or involved in different processes that have to do with resource development. So I think maybe that would be the most relevant thing for the participants. And some of the resources are digital. So if you have a chance, check out the FoRB learning platform, which has at least 2 courses at the moment now on. There is an introductory course that you can take in your own pace, in your own time. It's interactive. It's very good. And there's also the sub-module, which might be quite interesting for those of you who work in contexts where there are family laws or personal status laws, because that is a course that particularly takes up this issue and uses a case study, in this case from Lebanon, going in depth, understanding how men and women are affected differently when they actually marry under a specific family law within a given religious community, and especially in cases if they come from different communities, what kind of consequences they have. So definitely check out. We are working out on some more sub-modules. One that is being worked on right now is going to be about FoRB and gender-based violence. We hope to produce that within the next year, and then we will also see if we can develop some more. So that's one thing. A printed one, which is also available digitally, is our wonderful booklet written by Stefan Solans, which gives an introduction to freedom of religion or belief for everybody with a focus on women. That takes up some of the issues that I mentioned and much more. And actually also I was thinking about it as I was listening to Ruhi, and that also addresses very shortly, of course, also the issues of religious nationalism, of harmful fundamentalism, and how this again correlates with freedom of religion, belief, and women's rights. So do check out those things. So those would be my short, quick response.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And we're really looking forward to sharing out those resources with the attendees afterwards. So really appreciate that. And Ruhi, I'll turn the floor over to you to answer the same question if there are any specific activities or initiatives related to addressing gender and FoRB violations that you'd like to speak to.
Oh, see, like from our organizations, we are not directly involved in promoting FoRB, actually, because in most of our work, since we work with minorities community and we work with marginalized groups, so naturally in most of our work, this is one of the cross-component issues. But since we are not directly involved in promoting it, but of course there are a lot of organizations in Bangladesh, a couple of organizations who are working with focus on FoRB, and they have some wonderful publications. Right now, I cannot actually give you the name or details, but if you want, I can send you, the details so that you can look into the publications. Or even there are like some platform as well in Bangladesh, who are working towards promoting FoRB and who are actually, very closely looking into this dynamics of like how gender and FoRBs are intersectionally related to each other and correlations. So they're looking at these things. So just give me some time. I'll have it sent to you.
Brilliant. Really appreciate that.
But for Bangladesh, I would say in Bangladesh context, actually, there is a great need for academic research on these relations between the gender and FoRB, because we have very few. In fact, that's where I was struggling actually when I was making this presentation, because we don't have much research works on this. So that's a necessity of time that we start making some academic research on this. Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah, just it's important to address the gaps and where there needs to be work that might is already being done. And so I'm not seeing any questions or answers from our attendees, but thank you, Vija and Ruhi, so much for your time today for presenting. Everyone will be sharing this recording with registrants, and if you would like to share this with others, it will be available to do so. But otherwise, I wish everyone a good rest of their day or evening, and hope everyone takes care. Thank you so much.